Thanks, Dr. Sai. As Dr. Sai mentioned, my name is Lauren and I'm Clinical Research Coordinator here at UCSF in the Melanoma and Cutaneous Oncology Department. And hopefully today I will be able to demystify clinical trials for you. So, brief overview of my talk. First, I'll kind of give you an idea of what clinical research actually is. Then we'll discuss drug development and clinical trial development. And then we'll move on through the FDA approval process and talk about patients on trial. So first we'll kind of discuss the question, what is clinical research? And for me, the answer is the study of human health for prevention, treatment, diagnosis, or for relieving symptoms of a disease. Clinical research comes in a variety of forms and reaches all areas of medicine and health. And the purpose of clinical research in oncology is to better understand how cancer works and to develop novel therapeutics to treat cancer safely and effectively. So first I'll kind of describe two important trial types. On the left we have the observational trial, which is understanding a disease by watching. So in this type of trial we have researchers who are interested in understanding the physiology of the disease or understanding the progression of disease, and no treatment is given in this type of trial. On the right we have interventional trials, which is what we'll be discussing for the rest of the talk. And this is where we do give an intervention. So we give novel therapeutics or novel drug combinations to treat disease. So first we'll start with, how does a drug get to a clinical trial? And it starts in the lab with the identification of a target. So the other talks this morning have talked about targets that we've used and developed treatments for, such as BRAF or PD-1. And once we identify a target, we can develop a therapeutic to treat that target or pathway. And then that therapeutic is used in preclinical models, such as a cellular model or a mouse model. And these models are models that mimic disease, and they mimic the disease that we're trying to treat. Then once we see positive results in these preclinical models, then we could submit the drug for use in human clinical trials through the FDA. So this is an investigational new drug report. And this is submitted to the FDA. It's all of our preclinical information, and we submit that to the FDA for proof to start using in people. So we'll kind of pause on trial development for just a minute and talk about sponsorship. So UCSF gets funding for clinical research through a variety of mechanisms. On the left we have our governmental agencies. So one large one, of course, is the National Institutes of Health, or the NIH, and we get our funding from the National Cancer Institute. And on the right, a very common form of funding is our pharmaceutical companies. So often they're sponsors for our trials. And a lot of times they'll come to us with a drug that they have developed, and they'll essentially contract UCSF to perform the research. So it doesn't matter where we get our funding. We perform the research individually, and following good clinical practice, we can submit the data back to the company. So here I have, on the right, I have 3 drug companies and their therapies, which we've talked about earlier this morning. So we've got Merck, who developed Keytruda. We have Bristol Myers Squibb with nivolumab, or Opdivo. And we have Novartis with our targeted therapies, Tafinlar and Mekinist. So now we'll talk about the FDA drug approval process. So there are 4 phases. Phase 1 is the beginning of use of this therapeutic in human trials. And in this phase, we're looking at, is it safe? So we use a small population of patients, and we're looking at safety and dosing. If we determine that it's safe, we can move into phase 2, which is, does it work? So we're looking for efficacy here. And this is a slightly larger population where all of the participants on trial get the new therapeutic. And then once we can determine that it's both safe and effective, then we'll move into phase 3, where we're asking, is it better than what we already have in the clinic? Now these phase 3 trials are much larger. They're multi-site trials, so they can be at any hospital in the US, even around the world. And we're looking at comparing this novel therapeutic to what a patient would receive if they were in the clinic getting treatment. And then once we have a positive phase 3 trial, we can submit the drug for FDA approval and move into phase 4, which is what else can happen. So once we move into aftermarket research, we're looking at the drug, which is now used in clinics all over the US, and we're receiving information about side effects and kind of what happens on treatment with patients. So we have an idea of what happens based on the smaller population that we see in clinical trials in phase 3. But now we're kind of looking at, does the side effect happen a little bit more than we expect, a little bit less than we expect, and so on. And so that is phase 4. So here we have a diagram of kind of this FDA approval process. So of course we start in the lab with our bench science and our preclinical models, which are those mouse and cell models. And then once we see positive results there, we can move into our first use in humans, which is a phase 1 trial where we're looking at safety and dosing, so is it safe? And then phase 2, which is it effective? Phase 3, where we're comparing it to what a patient would get already in the clinic for that treatment. And then once we get to phase 3, we can submit to FDA approval. This usually takes 1 to 2 years. It can take a little bit less than that. It can take a little bit more than that, depending on the approval process. And then we move into the aftermarket phase 4. So how are clinical trials developed? So once the FDA gives approval for an investigational new drug to be studied in humans, then we kind of move into developing a protocol. So a protocol is a document. It's a thorough description of the study and the rationale behind the study. So this includes all of that preclinical data and supports our use in human trials. And it also gives a very thorough description of what a participant on trial will go through in terms of office visits, so seeing their doctor, how they'll be monitored safely throughout the trial, and then what constitutes them receiving treatment or coming off treatment, etc. So once we develop this protocol for the study, the protocol goes through a very thorough review. It's first going through the safety committee, the scientific committee. So the scientific committee looks at a protocol for scientific merit. So it's saying, is this study designed perfectly to answer the questions that the researchers want to know? And then it will go through the safety committee, which is our institutional review board. And we commonly refer to this as the IRB. And this safety committee looks at whether we're minimizing risk to the patient as much as possible and maximizing benefit. And this is an isolated board that has a number of physicians, researchers, even nurses, and it's a panel that goes through these protocols, so they're not the same as the researchers. And then during the course of the trial, we have very strict reporting requirements for safety. So anytime we get safety information, especially in the phase 3 trials where we have multiple sites, safety information is dispensed between the sites, and then the patients are notified of any new risks that we come across. So if you're participating in an interventional research trial, these are kind of the time points that we would meet. So first we have our informed consent. Once we get informed consent, you'll enter the screening period where we'll determine eligibility for enrollment. And then the patient will be put on treatment. And then we eventually will take you off treatment and you'll enter a follow-up period. And so starting with the informed consent, so of course to participate in a research trial, a participant must give consent. And we do this in the form of an informed consent document. So this is a more digestible version of the protocol. It has the study rationale, it has how many people we expect to be seen in the study. It has a very thorough list of all the risks of trial participation, including all the procedures and also the drug risks. And it has study timelines and information on what patients can expect during their participation on trial. Along with the informed consent document, we have the Research Subject Bill of Rights. So here in California, we have a complete other document that gives or outlines your rights as a research subject. And importantly, it says that you have the right to a full explanation of the study and the purpose of the study, that you have the right to know of the risks of the procedures performed for research purposes, that you have the right to know what benefit you can expect from your participation on trial. You have the right to be told of other options that may exist for your treatment. And of course, you have the ability to withdraw consent at any point during your time on the trial. So once we gain informed consent, you'll move into the screening period where we determine your eligibility for participation on the study. And we use inclusion and exclusion criteria to determine this. So these are characteristics that must be present to be included in the study trial. And these criteria are used to include patients who may benefit and exclude patients who may be harmed by participation on the trial. And importantly, it helps research decrease the amount of variables within their study to lead to accurate data and outcomes. So kind of behind the scenes, once a patient is on trial, they interact with a number of our staff, especially in the clinic. So we have research coordinators like myself who manage our clinical trials. We have investigational pharmacists who are trained to dispense our study drugs. We have research infusion nurses who are trained to administer those study drugs to patients. We have practice assistants who help with the scheduling and the insurance authorization requests. We have phlebotomists and radiology technicians who are also trained on our protocols to help us get the best outcomes we can. And then we have cancer center support. So this is just a very short list of the many departments we have here at UCSF in the Cancer Center. We have our safety monitoring committee, making sure patients are safe during their time on trial. We have protocol project managers that basically do all the behind the scenes paperwork to submit the protocol to the safety committee and also the scientific advisory committee. We have our budget team that helps us make sure that we have all the funding we need to proceed with our clinical trials. And then if we're working with a sponsor or a pharmaceutical company, they also have a study team that provides support during the course of our trial. And they also there are a lot of people that go through the data, analyze the data, and determine if we should move on with this study drug. So kind of for patients, how can I find a clinical trial? The best place to start is with your physician. They'll know the most about your disease type and what trials you may be eligible for. Online resources, we've got clinicaltrials.gov, which all of our clinical trials their information is required to be put on clinicaltrials.gov, so you can look there. We've got our National Cancer Institute website, cancer.gov/clinical trials. And then our kind of umbrella governmental funding agency, National Institutes of Health, and so it's nih.gov. And then of course, patient advocacy groups like AIM at Melanoma. You can find information for clinical trials there. So kind of in conclusion, all of our current therapeutic drugs, as we've talked about earlier this morning, have gone through the FDA approval process, and patients are benefiting by living longer lives as a result of these clinical trials. And so very critically, clinical trial participation is critical to increasing our knowledge about cancer, how it works, and our progress in fighting it. And with that, I will thank you for your time.